As football gradually returns across the country, the following webinar is brought to you by key Scottish FA staff to talk through the guidelines, some key reminders around child wellbeing and diversity and inclusion. This webinar addresses a number of areas, but for more information, please visit the Scottish FA website. Well, today marks a big day in the return to football. I am joined by a number of officials here from the Scottish FA to run through various areas of the return to football guidance. Paul McNeill, of course, heading it all up here today. Paul, what have we got in store and how important is it to remember all this guidance moving forward?
Thanks, Lewis. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a big day for us with regard to some new changes. As you know, at the turn of the year, we went back into another lockdown, but since some First Minister and government updates, we are delighted that from the 12th of March, we now have new guidance, which allows us again to start to see that slow environment back into the return to football, and delighted today that we'll be able to go through some things with respect to particularly our younger children who'll be able to get back out and play. And fingers crossed, as we continue on this process as we go forward, we'll start to see more of the football environment starting to open up. So today is much more of us, as you say, with a number of Scottish FA staff here, just to talk through the guidance, just to make sure everybody can be safe and everybody can kind of enjoy it. So we'll talk through this. So I think we're going to pass over to Danny to kind of just chat us through, Lewis, if that's okay.
Of course, Danny, and I guess one of the reiterating points that Paul makes here is that, yes, it is still early in the road and there's a lot to be happy about, but also to be mindful of. So can you run us through that guidance, Danny?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Lewis. So I'm just here very briefly just to talk about the guidance that's been permitted from Scottish Government and Sports Scotland. Just talk very briefly about the various points that clubs have got to consider, and also the training bubbles that have been permitted as well. As we know, all activity must take place outdoors. We are stressing to clubs that they've got to try and work with their facility provider to make sure that the place is risk assessed. The guidance that we are permitting at the moment, and from Scottish Government and from Sports Scotland, is for all Scottish FA registered clubs and organisations. Unfortunately, at this stage, as we're in the first phase of unlocking, no inter-club training or competition can take place. The reason for that is that Scottish Government want to try and minimise the amount of mixing between groups, and we hope that will change over the coming weeks and certainly months as we move on. Just at this stage, I just really want to remind all parents and carers, we do realise that it is frustrating, but for the vast majority of players across the country, parents and carers are not permitted to watch training and to be in and around the facility. There will be circumstances where individuals will have to have a parent or carer close by, and we really want to encourage you to speak to your individual club to make sure that can be done in a safe manner. But again, just to reiterate, for the vast majority of players across the country, that won't be possible. We'll talk a little about the facility access at the end, and we'll talk about how you can try and minimise that mixing of bubbles. And we just really want to reiterate as well, we want to try and keep the environment as safe as we possibly can as we move through this. Currently, contact, we're delighted to say, is permitted at this stage, but we are encouraging all players, coaches, officials, parents to stay physically distant in and out of sessions. Coaches definitely have to stay physically distant still, even though that the players can involve themselves in contact training. In terms of getting to and from training, parents are permitted to move out of the local authority area to take players to and from training, and we're just stressing that that's done as safely as we possibly can. And the final point is that Sports Scotland and Scottish Government have permitted up to 30 people per training bubble. So that bubble is essentially your training activity. We've recommended that should take place on a third of a pitch. And we're also stressing that the normal kind of player-coach ratios should be adhered to at all times. I think crucially for me, from a practical point of view, if you've got more space or less space, depending on your facility provider, just try and be as sensible as you possibly can about how many players you're managing to get into that space. And if you do have access to more space, unfortunately at this stage, you can't extend the training bubble it is a maximum of 30 individuals that you're allowed within that. And I'll talk a little bit about the 12 to 17 and the 18s who have got similar restrictions in place as well. Thanks, Paul. So 12 to 17-year-olds at this stage is non-contact training that's permitted. Parents and carers, again, can take players to and from training. We're recommending, because it's the first start for a lot of people, and unfortunately there's not been a lot of physical activity and sport taking place over the last 12 to 18 months. We're really encouraging or recommending that clubs limit their training sessions to twice per week and approximately 60 minutes per session. I think that'll lift, and we'll obviously want more players playing more often as we move through this, but this might be a good starter for you and your club as you're doing that. In terms of the restrictions, you're only permitted up to 15 individuals in your training bubble. So for many, that could be up to 13 players and 2 officials per, and we're recommending a quarter of a pitch. Again, similar to the other advice and guidance, if you've got more space or less space, we're just encouraging you to adhere to all the appropriate health and safety guidelines, and just please make sure that you're able to keep physically distant from other groups. Unfortunately, 13 might not feel like a good number for your squad, but that's what the restrictions currently permit. So that's just unfortunately where we're going to have to get to at the moment. So in terms of the activity that's permitted for adults or players aged 18 plus, we're doing exactly the same in terms of, the recommendation is maximum of twice per week for 60 minutes per session, and that is a recommendation. All group activity must be for a maximum of 15 individuals. So that could include your coaches and your players. And again, we've recommended a quarter of a pitch. You may have more, you may have less, but we certainly would think that would be an appropriate size for you. I think crucially, the main area for this is that both non-contact and all activity must take place within your local authority area. Unfortunately, at this stage, you can't travel out with your local authority to take part in training. That does have an impact on some players across the country, and at this stage all we can do is ask you to just remain physically active as much as you possibly can. So Paul, I think that's us covered those kind of main areas. That's the bit in terms of the guidance that we've adhered to, but I think it really crucially, just to reiterate, it's the start of a long process, and we're absolutely delighted that we've now got activity up and running, and hopefully the next few weeks and months are going to feel much more positive moving forward.
Absolutely. Paul, I guess one of the big points before we go across to Alison and David is that, yes, let's make it fun, but also safe. And that's got to be remembered and adhered to at all times.
Lewis, I think you're entirely right there, and some of my colleagues here with me who'll be able to kind of go into this in far more detail and talk about that. But I think the first thing before I pass over to Alison to talk through some of the others, I think we've got to remember, regardless of what age you are, we have to try and make this fun. COVID's been tough on a lot of people. This is a great opportunity to take a big step forward, but particularly for our younger children, let's put a smile on their face, let's make them happy, and no matter what age you are, let's make sure this activity is enjoyable, because we want people to smile. So I'm going to pass you over to Alison, who'll be able to talk through a little bit more about our child wellbeing and how we will try and make sure that children are as safe as we possibly can.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think the most important thing from my perspective is to remember that everyone's experience of the pandemic has been different. There will be really mixed feelings amongst both children and young people and adults about going back. There'll be a great deal of excitement for many, but there'll also be a little bit of nervousness. So it's so important to listen to the young people that are coming back, regardless of their age. Listen and communicate with them in terms of the activity, really from the earliest possible stage that you can in terms of planning for your club. It's been a long time away from football for both children and adults, so it's really important to understand how people are feeling, what experiences they've had, and take that into account in terms of your planning. So really involve the children and young people in your planning from as early a stage as possible. In terms of making sure that the return is safe, it's so important to refresh essentially all of your adults and your children and young people about the child wellbeing and protection policy that you have at your club. Make sure that all of your coaches and your adults involved around the club know what to do if there's any concerns that come up. So, as I said at the outset, everyone's experience of the pandemic has been different. Unfortunately, home is not a safe environment for every child and young person. So we do expect there to be some more concerns than perhaps we would have normally. So it's really important that everybody knows exactly what to do and knows who the child wellbeing and protection officer at the club is, because that is the person they should be speaking to if they have any worries about that. And on the child wellbeing and protection officer, again, really important to involve that person in the planning for the return of football, and as you move through the different phases right from the outset. There's lots of information that can help you. It's available on the Scottish FA website in terms of policies and procedures or guidance. There's training that you and your adults at the club can complete that's available on the Scottish FA website, and again might be useful in terms of a refresh. And of course, as always, any questions or issues, you can get in touch with your relevant ANA, or please get in touch with us at the Wellbeing and Protection team at the Scottish FA, and we'd be really glad to support you.
Thank you, Alison. David McArdle, we'll go over to you now from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, of course, and the importance of understanding both physical and mental health areas in the return to football as well.
Yeah, Lewis, I think it's vital that all coaches understand that people will be on a different physical journey during COVID. Some people might be still recovering from COVID. Some people might have exercised extensively during this period, and some people wouldn't have been actually able to do anything from this. So remember, when people return back to football, young or adults, they're going to be at different physical standpoints. So please ensure that you take that expectation into account when you're setting out your training sessions, when you're thinking about how we can make things fun and active for the participants, that your physical health is very, very much linked to your mental well-being. And I would encourage all coaches and all adult participants within the game to undertake the Scottish FA's mental health awareness course. Now, this is not going to make you a mental health expert, but it's going to allow you to understand the challenges that people may be going through, how to spot some of the initial signs, and then how to get them the help that they require, because this is going to be a challenging time for everybody. And the next stage of this pandemic is going to be how we can look after people's mental well-being. Now, the Scottish FA will be coming out across the regions with club culture workshops. Now, I encourage all clubs within the game to keep their eye open for these, and your club development manager within your local region will be putting out advertisings for these in the next couple of weeks. But there's also a vast amount of fantastic resources out there. Young Scot, the Samaritans, Sam H websites have got endless amounts of mental health information that can help you understand the conditions a little bit more, and also understand how you can seek the help that people may require and how you can signpost them to that. And finally, it's vital that normally we would have phone numbers put up in changing rooms and changing spaces and clubhouses to state the breathing space number, the Samaritans number. Now, at this current time, we're not able to get access to these buildings in the same way as we had before. So how can we ensure our players and our participants have got these numbers to hand? Now, that might be at the end of training sessions. You remind them that there's support out there for people. You put it out in your group WhatsApps. Every so often, you put the phone numbers there. You pin them to the top of your Twitter feeds. But it's vital that people understand that there is support out there. And at any time that somebody is feeling low, is feeling challenged, then there is fantastic resources in Scotland out there that people can support them to ensure that a mental well-being issue doesn't then form into a mental health issue, and then we start to worry about people's long-term well-being. So I think it's vital for people to understand, as Alison said, we're all excited to get the opportunity to get back on the pitch, but that then will also come with further challenges and further things that as football we have the opportunity to have an impact upon.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Alison, as well. Some vital points to consider there. Danny, I think I'll come back to you now in terms of COVID training and the importance there as well.
Yeah, so I think just to reiterate as well what the guys are saying, absolutely I'm delighted that we're back, and we've had an incredible turnout for individuals on the COVID officer training. So I think we had up to about 14,000 people involved in football who'd currently undertaken that, stressing that if you're a new coach to the game or a current coach, I would certainly take that training just to get more advice and guidance on what's appropriate. And secondly, we've now worked with Sports Scotland to create a training platform which is available for players over the age of 13 and parents as well, just to kind of reiterate those key safety points as well. And it would be great if we had the same uptake from football as well, taking on those two courses. So it's really, really important for us, but really positive as well. And thanks to everybody who's undertaken that training up to this point.
Excellent. Paul, I guess as we move on, any kind of additional points with regards to perhaps pitch setup as well we're looking at next?
Yes, certainly. I think it's so important as we come back just to remind ourselves again of some of these things. So again, we have to make sure that we see how we set the pitches up. So again, we want people just to kind of think again and go, it's been a while since we were there. So again, thinking about knowing that congestion. So where are the pinch points as you turn up? We'll talk a little bit about mark out. I think Danny's already mentioned this, and I'm sure he'll come back in a little bit and say, right, here's what we mean in terms of if you've got your space, how can you be creative? How can you make sure you've got the right space? But as Danny alluded to very, very well, make sure that those bubbles are the correct sizes. Alison's already went over very well about we make sure that well-being and we're following all those particular things that are there. And just probably remembering those particular things that might have just dropped out because it's been a bit of a time. So remember high hygiene. So again, are we sanitising before we got there? Are we making sure our equipment's sanitised? Are we making sure that we've got the register for test and protect to make sure that we know everybody's there? And again, I think that's getting that message over to our parents, to the volunteers, to the coaches, to the players, so people understand what they need to do. And again, it's probably that about avoiding congestion. So we don't want everybody turning up at the time. So can we stagger the start times? Can we make sure people's there? So as Danny alluded to, that COVID officer training, that person maybe with a high-vis vest on saying, stop, wait, stay in your car, come out. And again, it's just talking about that, making sure everybody knows the responsibility. So important. And if we get these things right, as we've seen the last time, it runs quite well. So I think as Danny alluded to, and I'm sure Danny maybe add a bit in here in the next slide, is just think about what your pitch looks like, how you can get those zones set up, making sure there's maybe one-way systems in there, and everybody understands what way they need to go through. And again, just how you maybe set it up in terms of quarters or thirds of pitches. And it'll be different from other suppliers and other people who'll be able to put them out. But again, making sure that you understand when you turn up at that venue. And again, in terms of just the kind of zones and making sure that kind of buffering zone. So Danny, I don't know if you want to add anything in, but this was the way we kind of set up before, making sure that 2 metres there, the groups don't then kind of mix. So we make sure that everybody knows where you're going on the pitch so it can be safe. Danny, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add into that one.
It's just to reiterate, Paul, we've given guidance around about a quarter or a third of a pitch. Now, all pitches across Scotland are not the same size. Your access to the facility and your facility provider may differ as well. I think what we are essentially doing is we're giving recommendations. The most critical thing is the number of people that are involved in each of your bubbles. So just think, and you can work with your club and speak to your parents and speak to the players, just work through the process where if you're in a quarter or a third or a half a pitch, just make sure that you're not impinging on the other bubble, and there's a process and everybody understands that. I mean, ultimately, and I know we'll talk about this right at the end, there's going to be some amount of people who are absolutely delighted to get back onto the pitch and buzzing. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to be a killjoy, but we're trying to just inform you that it's a process, and the quicker we get through this process and everybody understands their roles and responsibilities, then there's going to be more activity taking place in the coming weeks and months, which we're absolutely delighted about.
Excellent. Well, I guess as we look to wrap up, a reminder that to follow that guidance, Paul, and obviously there are differences between the age groups that are worth always remembering as well. Some great input as well from David and Alison. So thank you all. But Paul, Danny, if there's any final thoughts or bits of information you want to drop in as we look to wrap the webinar, then feel free.
Yeah, I think Lewis, you say that. I think it's so invaluable to have David, Alison, and everybody else on this call. We are really, really excited. But again, we have that cautious one where we want to make sure that people go, oh yeah, I forgot, need to remember hand sanitizer. Right, okay, how do I make sure I'm safe turning up? And I think Alison and David put those points over. COVID's been difficult, but here we have a wee bit of a chance. We see this wee glimmer of hope, a bit of light coming down the road, where we can go back into the garage, we can find those footballs again, we can start pumping them up, we can start thinking, do you know something? If we all follow the guidance, if we all do that, the return to football will come again, and we can see it coming along. So at this moment in time, we are excited, but we're just asking people, breathe. Think about how you're going to do it safely. Make sure everybody understands what they're going to do. Make sure people are having fun. But more importantly, make sure people are safe. Because if we do that, and we all collectively do it together, we can take another step soon, and then another step. And soon, we'll be back to football as we remember it. So it's so important that we do that. So I thank all my colleagues for that, and I thank every volunteer out there, because together we can make this happen.